Welcome back, everyone. I think you've all been here before, so I'm glad that you're back. So today we're going to be talking about skills for supporting faculty through the tenure process. And we'll also have time today at the end of the section to really apply all of the different things that we've learned over the course of this series. Our agenda today is we're going to sort of do a welcome check-in, recap where we've come from, where we're going. We'll spend the first hour really digging into some of the new key concepts and then discussing those. We'll take 10-minute breaks at the end of each hour. So at 10:50 and 11:50, we'll take a break. The 11 o'clock hour, we'll be really focusing on the scenarios. We may get to those this first hour, but we're going to do some scenario activities. And let's see, Heather, I see that some people are having, so is it solved or?
I'm emailing everybody on the registration list right now, so it should be solved in a minute.
Okay, I wonder what happened. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate that. So she was just sending me a message that some people were having trouble getting in. So we'll have a time at the end to do reflections and wrap up. So the official end time will be 12:30. If you want to stay on and discuss, we'll be here till 1 o'clock for some bonus discussion time. And so again, really grateful that you're here. So our goal today is to talk about some really specific skills that we can apply, and then we're going to look at them through some scenarios. So the scenarios, if you were with us last year, they're similar. I've edited them to be a little bit more aligned with Elgin's tenure review process. Some of the feedback last year is it was a little too R1 sort of level. So they're just a little bit different this year. And I really want to make sure that we spend some time giving you an opportunity to look at all the tools that you've gained over the last 3 months and figure out how to apply them. I just co-wrote a paper with a workshop participant for a conference paper. It was her first conference paper, which is super exciting for her. But in her conference paper, she writes, "I've participated in so many different kinds of training, and I've never learned anything that has helped me directly apply this to my work." And so I commented, "Ouch," because she had just gone through like this year-long program with me. And so then we talked about it, and then I was deeply confused because the paper was like all the things I taught her. And so what she then shared is she's like, "Well, you gave us like 5 books, like really with practical tools and strategies. But what she needed was to make her own sense of it and give herself the framework for how she was going to apply that to her job." And so it was a really aha moment for me as a facilitator and professional development provider, is making sure that we take time to really process, these are the tools that you've given me. How am I going to apply them to my job and my life and my daily functions? And that's what we want to make sure that we give you all some time to do today. Because it can be overwhelming, the amount of resources and tools and strategies that you gather from any kind of learning opportunity like this. And so if we don't take the time and the opportunity to really directly connect that to our work, it can get lost. So we want to spend some time doing that. Hey, Tyler, welcome. Sorry about the issues with the link. Not sure what happened there.
No, all good. I think we just emailed to folks, so you should have a few more people join us momentarily.
Awesome.
Good. We can troubleshoot what happened with the Zoom link later, but I'm glad some of you found us and were able to communicate back. So I've put in the link, or Casey has added back in the link some quick links. So these are going to be the resources that we're going to work through today. So you've got the PDF handout, which is the feedback reflection tool, which is one of the new tools that we'll be able to use today. You've got the Padlet you've got 2 Padlets. The first Padlet is the scenarios. And so we'll pull that up later. But if you've got multiple screens to be able to access it, it will be helpful for you to do that. But Let's first sort of do a little bit of a recap of where we've come from. So back in October, geez, I'm in a different life, I guess. Back in February, we talked about nudges, right? And we learned about the practices for reducing the influence of bias on the tenure review process. And so we learned about the nudging tool, and we learned about cognitive biases. Back in March, we talked about the guidelines for shifting from gatekeeping to stewardship. And so we had a tool there. And so today we're really going to be focusing on the sort of question of like, are you listening? And ways that we can improve how we listen, some practical skills for that. And so I'm glad that you're here today. So let's do a little bit of check-in with who's here. So let's do a sort of roundabout share of like, let's see, where'd my prompt go? Pardon me for jumping ahead here. So I want to give you a chance to reflect on what's something that you've learned in the February or March sessions that you've been able to put into practice, or something that you've just continued to think about from those learning opportunities moving forward. You can use the Slido or just unmute and tell us what's on your mind. So what's something that you've learned in the last couple of months from this workshop series that you've been able to put into practice, or that you're thinking about putting into practice?
I'm just going to talk. Justin Robertson,
Great.
Associate Dean of CABS. I really have appreciated everything that we've learned. Obviously, there's been so many really great pieces of advice and information to utilize, but I'm running a tenure committee for the first time this semester, and I have implemented the session pledge. When we meet, we do that every single time, and that's been great. It starts the conversation and gets us thinking and connecting in the right ways right off the bat, making us mindful of what we should and shouldn't be doing in terms of the conversation. And we've talked about unbiasing as well. And the last meeting that I had with that group, I shared the list of biases with them, and we went around and people just talked about particular ones that they felt like they needed to keep in mind because maybe they had some inklings or some concerns that those were their biases that they needed to make sure that they were keeping in check. So I thought it was a really great way just to start our meetings, to have those conversations and really kind of set the tone for the entire conversation that we were having. So I just want to thank you for providing us with those resources. It's been very helpful.
That's great. I love that. And I love that you started the meeting and you had everyone talk through those cognitive biases, because what is also a result of that is accountability, right? So when you created this shared language and you'd had people talk about, well, this might be a challenge for me, that gives you an opportunity to help remind people of something when they might stumble into that. Thanks, Justin. Heather, what are you thinking?
I was just going to say, one thing that's been really helpful is just the vocabulary that has been incorporated into the conversation, and just, like, in addition to, like Justin said, having that formal structure to be able to run the meetings, just having vocabulary to support any conversations about any bias that come up has been very helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Heather. Chris.
One of the things that I found incredibly useful, which was from, I believe, the first session, was the establishing ground rules at the beginning of meetings. That works wonderfully in any area, I think. That, and the thing that I've noticed is, no matter how wonderful the training is and how many tools we have, if the administrators leading committees are not committed to it, we're not going to accomplish what we're trying to. So I've had both administrators who are completely on board and all in, and things run smoothly, to the other extreme with administrators who just don't think that this is important, and now you're just shouting into the wind again. So it just really drives home that it has to be top down participation in these endeavors, or they're just not going to make any significant progress.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Chris. It's a really good reminder of how important it is for us to really practice what we preach and how easy it can be for us to get distracted by the task list. I was deeply reminded by this. I spent the early part of the week at the National Academy of Engineering working on a big report that 130 PhDs have been contributing to for the last few months, and now 13 of us are going to try to write up all of the work that we've been doing, and it's on inclusive mindset for systemic change in engineering. But what happened is when we all got together, many of us the first time we're meeting, there were no ground rules. There were no opportunities for us to be able to speak truth to power in the moments where we weren't actually reflecting the values that literally brought us there, that we're trying to create this report. And it wasn't that it was malintent, right? It was just when you put, dozen engineers in a room, they get really task driven of like, we got to write a paper and we got to put this report together. But we forgot that we are all humans doing work to rehumanize engineering. And so that's something that we have to push on. And when I spoke with the facilitators, he was like, oh, I don't do woo woo. And I was like, so you don't do humans? Like humans have feelings and emotions, and we all contribute them in many ways to this work. And so sometimes as administrators and leaders, you're going to come up with that of like, we don't have time and space for the humanity of this work. But that's what we have to step up and acknowledge, that we are humans trying to do work that is rehumanizing the tenure process, rehumanizing the way in which we educate. And that sometimes I also get so task driven, I forget to check in with people. So again, it's how are we practicing what we're preaching? To Chris's point, it's this tension of, are we just checking boxes, or we remember who is at the table that we need to be able to do that work. So thanks for that. Any other things that you like to share of how you've applied some of the work? All right. Well, you'll have time to continue contributing your ideas and reflections. Maybe you'll be reminded as we work through today. As always, I do want to remind you that we are really focused on changing systems and not people, and really being thoughtful to recognizing what are the barriers to our success, our barriers to employing these ideas, and make sure that we're adding in those supports. And so the goal is that you see the tools that we've gathered throughout this process. These are supports for reducing those barriers. They're meant to be really practical ways to reminders for creating those sort of shared agreements and shared vocabulary for how we work together. People don't like to be told they need to change. If you do, then you are self-aware and special. But most people don't like to be told that we need to change. And so our goal is to change the way in which we operate, the way in which we make those decisions, so that we can employ these things more easily. Thanks for Justin for bringing it up. And I want to remind us about our session pledge, that we want to do our best to stay engaged, especially when we go into the small groups. If you get into a small group that you're not able to contribute, let the people know and pop back out so I can make sure that the groups are interactive. I'm also depending on you all to help us share the mic so that everybody has the opportunity to contribute, and that we can pull others in, the quiet voices. We want to be thoughtful to support others wherever they are in this journey, and then really remind ourselves that we're here to learn and to stretch and reflect in that process. Now, the outline for today's conversation, we've got 3 key things that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about asset mindset, empathic listening, and intentional feedback. And so to dive into asset mindset, I like this imagery here of the sort of glass half full, glass, or however you see it, kind of imagery, because when we talk about asset mindset, it's this prompt of thinking about, are we focusing our attention on opportunities or problems? Are we focusing in on the strengths or the weaknesses? Like, what is it that people are adding versus what people don't have? And then what can be done instead of what can't be done? And so I have a little image here that something that I showed last year. So if you were here with us, then you may remember. But when we change the way we see things, the things that we see change. So if we zoom in and hone in on this little picture of this cleaner shrimp, it looks like it's just a cute little cleaner shrimp on a rock. But when we zoom out, when we change the way we see things, it is a cleaner shrimp that's picking out the teeth of a moray eel, right? Now, the moray eel could look at this cleaner shrimp as a nuisance, but the cleaner shrimp is not a nuisance to the eel. He is helping him by cleaning out his mouth, right? And so if the moray eel were to like get irritated with it, he could just eat it, right? But when he takes a value mindset, an asset mindset, he says, hey, this little bugger is helping me, right? It's adding value to my life and doing something that he can't do, right? He doesn't have little appendages that can help sort of keep his mouth clean and healthy. And so this is, an example of how we can create this asset mindset, really thoughtfully considering what's the value that somebody brings? What is it that there are different ways of knowing and doing and being, and how does that contribute something new and novel to a space that may be different than how the status quo or the sort of normal dominant ways in which we operate function? In this example, this happens to also be called a symbiotic relationship. So an association between these pairs of species, but it is absolutely an asset mindset. I always love this questioning, this thoughtfulness of asking what else might be true. This framing was given to me as when I was in when I was working on my doctorate, and I was really spinning out about something in somebody's treatment of me, and my mentor and friend was like, Megan, I want you to stop. She says, I want you to ask yourself this 5-word sentence, what else might be true? And instead of honing in on this one response, so in the scenario in which this came up is I thought, this person is out to get me. They have reported something, and I had just really honed in on this. And so she said, stop and ask what else might be true. And so I began to come up with 5 different scenarios in which might explain the outcome. And with this particular person who I just thought was out to get me, turns out she had just been diagnosed with brain cancer, right? And it had nothing to do with me. And when I stopped to ask all of these questions, it helped me to practice more empathy with her rather than seeing her as like an adversary based on how I thought she was treating me. When I stopped to ask imagine all these other possibilities, it created a more healing relationship with her, because I wasn't just thinking she's out to get me, right? And I didn't know, I learned later that she had just been diagnosed with this really terrible cancer. And so this is a really helpful tool for us. So when we really decrease our focus on what is wrong, so that's a deficit-based thinking, and we increase our focus on what is right or what else might be true, that's the asset-based thinking, we build trust, we strengthen relationships, and we increase outcomes. And so asset mindset, admittedly, there is a dearth of research on really understanding the applications of asset and deficit mindset. And it's something I've been trying to figure out how to teach. But it's really a sort of way of just asking, what's the value that this person brings? So rather than saying this isn't how we do it, this isn't how I would do it, just a quick question of how do I see value in this and how do I celebrate that? So the next key piece of our conversation today is around empathy. So let's start a little conversation here of just practicing some reminders to ourselves. What is empathy? You can contribute to Slido, you can just unmute and share. But when you think of empathy, what does it mean to you? A couple of people contributing.
It's Tyler. I just think empathy is the ability to connect and understand how other people are feeling
Yeah,
and relate
the
to them.
ability. Thanks so much, Tyler. The ability to connect, to understand, to relate. On the screen, we've got understanding someone else's feelings. So I heard a lot when you said, Tyler, connect, relate, stepping outside yourself and seeing other person's situation. And so empathy is really connecting with the experiences of other. It requires a human-centered focus. And so the definition here, so empathy is that ability to understand and share the feelings of another. It is connecting to the emotion of another person is experiencing and not the actual experience. So you don't have to have had the same lived experience, but you can practice empathy, and practice is exactly what it is, right? Like it's something that we can learn and employ. So when we practice that, we're connecting with the emotion of like, I know what it feels like to be rejected, to feel alone, to feel. I had a friend text me right before we started that her father-in-law died, right? So like you have to connect with the emotion that someone's feeling, and like and that's very different than sympathy, right? So sympathy is there's a great video, we won't watch it today, but by Brene Brown, of like the difference between empathy and sympathy, and I encourage you to Google that and watch it. But it's her sort of narrative of looking at the difference of sympathy. Sympathy is like looking down and saying, oh yeah, that sucks, or like, whereas empathy is really sort of getting down in the muck and mire of it and just sitting with someone and connecting. And so empathy, and this is Brene Brown's quote. So, here's the link, Casey. You can drop that in the chat for everyone. So empathy fuels connection, whereas sympathy drives disconnection. She says in the video, she says, empathy is a skill that can bring people together and make people feel included, while sympathy creates an uneven power dynamic and can lead to more isolation and disconnection. And so, particularly when we're talking about creating a more inclusive and equitable environment for tenure, power is strife in this process, right? The whole process is in many ways a function of power. Somebody has power over someone else's career, and how they make that decision. And so when we're talking about this work, we want to figure out how do we reduce those power dynamics so that we can make people feel included and valued. So this is a concept by Teresa Wiseman that actually Brene does in that video, but there are 4 different qualities of empathy. The first is perspective taking, the second, staying out of judgment, the third is recognizing emotion, and the fourth is communicating connection. And so this is really an opportunity to feel, you're choosing to feel with people, and it is absolutely the vulnerable choice and how we communicate. So perspective taking is really trying to sort of put yourself in the shoes of another person. If you were to think about from their view, from their worldview, understanding all the intersections the best you can of their lived identity, how can you really understand what it is that they might be experiencing? So when we look at the scenarios here shortly, I want us to figure out how do we take the perspective of both the committee person that we're going to be talking about, and what's the perspective of the committee member. And so that helps us really look at the example from both ways. The next key quality of empathy is staying out of judgment. Now, this can be really hard for a lot of people, and I probably fit into this, but realizing that judgment is not about empathy at all, right? It's about, it's putting people in boxes, it's making a lot of assumptions. And so we have to ask ourselves, am I employing judgment in this, or how am I really connecting to the human in it? Recognizing emotion. So to me, this means that you're recognizing their emotion and yours in response to what it is that they're saying, and learning to prioritize their emotion. And then the final is really communicating connection with them. That's the notion of really sitting with someone and saying, hey, I see that what you're going through is hard. I see that it's hurting you. I see that it's affecting you. And then just really trying to create space for someone to also connect to their emotions and how they're experiencing that. So this empathy connects to the sort of classic golden rule, we're going to compare and contrast these, but the golden rule is the sort of something we all learned in kindergarten or maybe before. This notion to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, to treat people how you want to be treated. Now, at the surface, this might sound good, right? But if I treated Manuel how I want to be treated, who is that prioritizing? It's prioritizing me, right? It's not prioritizing Manuel. Whereas the platinum rule, and I don't know who invented this, but the platinum rule is this variation of the golden rule that calls for a more thoughtful approach when dealing with others. It asks that you do unto others as they would want to be done to them, aka treat others how they want to be treated. In case you can drop the link to an article I wrote on this. And so how do we know how other people want to be treated? The short answer is you don't, right? And so not unless you make it your business and your priority and your objective to find out. So what barriers, this is a conversation for us, what barriers prevent us from practicing empathy? And I'll add in the asset mindset. So what barriers prevent us from practicing asset mindset, empathy, and the platinum rule? What do you think? So you can unmute, you can contribute on the poll. What do you think?
I think you touched upon, no, Manny,
No,
you
go
go
ahead.
first.
Now I was starting to write a question on the chat, but this is a perfect opportunity for that question. It's when you mention the word power, I think that's a particular barrier, especially when it's present in someone's experience unconsciously, right? And to the extent that that power is wrapped up in their own identity, right? It's going to prevent them in a lot of cases from being empathetic and seeing situations from that other person's perspective, because doing that means weakening my own identity. And so I can't really do that.
Yeah. So the challenge then becomes for us to be inclusive leaders. We have to reduce the way in which our identity, our ego is tied to power, or at least recognizing the power that we have and making choices to step out of that power. I don't know. I think in my journey to trying to become an inclusive leader, it's this recognition of I have learned that I find more power in getting out of the way and elevating other people than I have when I just stay in the position of the spotlight. And that's taken a lot of self-work to be able to get there.
Well, yeah, part of that is self-awareness on your end, right? But also bravery that doesn't reflect a weakness on you and instead a strength. I talk to people in the corporate world a lot. A lot of my friends are in the corporate world, in the banking institutions, and most of them males, and they speak with that language of power, right? And it's like almost when you are speaking about compassion or humanism, it's like something really foreign to them, and that's not something that is practiced.
So what I heard and what you just said is also a function of patriarchy. So patriarchy is a sort of system of masculinity that sort of creates these written and unwritten rules of how we operate. And human focusing on humans, empathy, emotion, these have been traditionally characterized as feminine qualities. And so they aren't prized in industry. That's why this guy, the facilitator, said to me, I don't do woo woo, right? Like that was patriarchy and how he facilitated that. There's no space for that here. And that's a function of his own lived experience and his own, worldview. And when you get stuck in that, and engineering, which is, my profession, is deeply masculine centered, it really gets perpetuated in that. And so that self-awareness and choice to step outside of that. Thanks, Manuel. Christina, what were you going to add?
No, thanks, Manuel, because it makes me, I feel like there's a connection, and this aligns with, I think, some of the norms that you had introduced in the beginning, that so often it takes time. It takes time. And when you get into default mode settings where it's easier to focus on task, it's easier to get into those patterns. And it's often hard when you're so consumed with those things, or you have to, because that work and that labor needs to happen, that can often fall, the human piece can often fall to the wayside. The other element too is that when you're truly trying to understand what people need, particularly with the platinum rule, it's also what I can imagine is like fighting the knee-jerk reaction of like, how does that relate to me? And to Manny's point around like my own identity, and really not necessarily viewing things as contradictory, but rather than saying, no, this information may be helpful for me. And that my response needs to be proportional to the information that's presented, not to the extreme, or not reacting to something that hasn't shown up yet, or to some insecurity that is about me and not about the person who I'm trying to support. So time, energy, and a lot of that reflective work, I imagine that is continuously happening.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. So we've got some additional contributions here on the screen. So other barriers that prevent us are an emphasis on tired. Anybody tired? Anybody need a nap? It sounds like. Maybe that was part of a phrase there. Being drained, trauma that
It
you
was part of a phrase. The whole thing was tired, that there's been too much drama and trauma over the last several years, that so many of us are just stretched so thin, and somehow it got split into a bunch of different words.
Well, people elevated tired. So, so what I guess sort of simplifying that phrase would just be like exhaustion, right, from the process of this work. And it truly can be exhausting in how we apply this work, especially if we don't feel empathy and connection with others to support us in those journeys. Another person says that you don't truly know or understand another person well enough. Yeah. And not everyone is willing to or feel comfortable to be their selves and authentic selves with you, which is also a function of power and privilege, by the way, right? And so our challenge is to reduce the ways in which power shows up, and reduce the way that privilege shows up, so that people can have that opportunity to allow you to know them. Anything else is coming up for you for this?
Yeah, the other thing that comes up is probably not knowing how to be empathetic, right? So it is the competency of one of the major therapies in counseling is a humanistic approach, that at the very nature of therapeutic work is being able to practice empathy, right, in a counseling session. That's the part of the nature of the theory, that in order to provide change in someone else, you have to create a space where the person feels that they're being listened and accepted. And that takes a lot of skill, a lot of patience, a lot of work to be able to do that. And so I wonder, obviously on a more relational level, not therapeutic level, it's also work. It's a lot of work. And if people are not focusing on that skill, it's going to be very hard to get good at as well.
Yeah. Especially if you live and function in a system that doesn't value that. So within counseling, it values that. Within other disciplines, it may not. And so it's hard to focus your energy to practice something that isn't always rewarded. All right, so let's, speaking of listening, let's talk a little bit about listening. So when we talk about listening, I've got a quote here by Stephen Covey, where he says, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. How many of you, does that resonate with? Yeah, all of us, right? We are all trying to figure out, how do I capture this idea, and we forget to listen? Or how many times have you asked a question and then you literally forget to listen to the response because you're already sort of thinking about something else? And so for this, I want us to think about this sort of notion of am I listening? Who am I listening to? And how can I help others listen? How do my mindset, my worldview, and biases filter what I hear? So how does my mindset, my worldview, and the biases that all of us hold, how is it becoming a filter to what we hear and a barrier? So I want you to think of a time, before we move forward to look at some details about listening, I want you to think of a time when you felt heard. Think of a time when you felt heard. What was unique about that interaction that led you to feel like the other person truly listened to you? And then how did you feel as a result of being heard? So think of a time when you felt heard. What was unique about that interaction? And how did you feel as a result of being heard? If somebody has an example, I'd love to hear an example, maybe from somebody who hasn't shared much yet today. What does it feel like to feel heard?
I think maybe it happened to me once when I was in the same situation as the other person, like a long time ago, and it's easier to maybe understand. So you can hear more actually when you have been in that situation. And then it's easier to understand that other person because you've been there. You've been in those shoes and you went through this thing. So it's just easier to hear and to, be empathetic in that case. That's my opinion.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Eva. Anybody else?
I think when you feel like you've been listened to, it establishes a measure of trust between individuals.
So when you feel like you've been heard, it creates trust. It absolutely does. Thanks, Tyler. Anything else?
I'm sure too, it has the feeling of your thoughts actually have an impact and actually have some sort of consequences and meaning. I can think about times I felt heard is when I've been in conversations and something that's been shared is referenced later on. There's some sort of building of puzzle pieces going together. That is not just sort of, oh, I spoke into the wind and then somebody else spoke into the wind, but it's there's actually impact and change in relationship to what's being said.
Yeah, so when we feel heard, there are typically resulting feelings to that of that you feel valued, included, and that you belong, right? So your ideas are part of this big puzzle, And so you have these other sort of feelings, and these are deeply connected to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Remember, I think we've talked about this. Belonging is in the middle before we have any sort of feelings of actualization and efficacy. And so listening is such a crucial part of this work if we want people to experience feelings of, you know, feeling valued and included and belong. And, you know, what brought us together in this work is initially talking about the experiences of traditionally marginalized and excluded people who do not normally have deep feelings of feeling valued and included and affirmed and belonged. And so listening is a really key part of that. Manuel, what are you thinking?
Well, I'll just share one experience and then I'll shut up. Because for me, it was a very telling experience when you asked the question the way you did is about when you were heard. It was actually an uncomfortable experience initially, but I can pinpoint it. It was one of my first semesters of doctor work, counseling skills class that I took, and it was an exercise that the professor was doing about having people listen to each other. And in that exercise, I felt the sort of the weight and I guess the amount of attention that was focused on just me, right? And you ask, so what was unique about that? Well, I think the little things, right? The eye contact from that other person, the body posture directed just to me, more than anything, the attention, like that person closed everything else that was happening around the room and just focused on me. And at that very moment, it's like, whoa, it felt, for the first instant, it's like, wow, this is what it means to be listened to, right? I felt this transparency that that person knew exactly what I was saying. And then the micro reflections along the way, right? It's like, yeah, you're following what I'm saying or what I'm doing as well, and how I'm feeling. So those little pieces, I think the little things were the ones that stood out to me and indicated that in that moment, I was being, like someone else says, right, valued.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Manuel. Anything else? All right, so let's talk a little bit about some degrees. So we're going to break listening up into a couple of elements. So we're going to talk about active listening, and then we're going to talk about the degrees of active listening, the levels of active listening, and see how they all map together. So active listening is this ability to focus completely on the speaker, just like Manuel said. It's to understand their message, to comprehend the information, and to respond thoughtfully. So unlike passive listening, which is the act of hearing a speaker without retaining their message, this highly valued interpersonal communication skill ensures that you're able to engage and then later recall specific details without needing information repeated. So like Tyler said, when he contributes something in an environment and then it's brought up later, it makes you feel heard. You'll have to forgive that me and my thoughts and stories on this are related to this experience in DC this week. But when we talk about power, so I was the youngest person there, and I'm 40, so I'm not that young, right? But it's got all of these people who are so far in their careers. Many of them are retired. They've had really prolific and like tremendous careers within engineering education. And there were some people who were really good at listening and doing, like Tyler said, of like connecting back. But then there was also these moments as somebody who would just like bring up an idea, you know, a day later, and I'd be like, I said that 10 times yesterday, and now you've said it. You didn't point back to me. And now it's like you, who are retired provost of a major university, that's when it sticks, right? Like that's not active listening, and it's not inclusive leadership. So inclusive leadership would have been to take something that somebody with no power was saying, or less power was saying, and who has been saying for this entire. So the thing I've been on a soapbox with this program is that they have not involved students in it at all. So from day one, I've been a big critic of that. And I've been a critic of it like every single step of the way. So on the first day when we were all together, I was again critiquing it. And then on the last day of writing, she brings it up and it's like it was suddenly her idea. And I was like, that's not listening, right? That's not connecting. It's not saying, Megan's right. Like, we should have thought of this sooner. And so, what feeling does that create for people in that space when you don't connect back? If she had been truly active listening and practicing inclusive leadership, she would have reflected back to those other elements because, like Tyler said in his experience, it makes people feel valued, included, and encouraged. Other opportunities when that happens would have been for another one of the PIs to be like, thanks for reflecting back on the thing that Megan's been on the soapbox on for so long, right? So that's other opportunities for people in positions of power to point back. So active listeners, they use these sort of verbal and nonverbal techniques to show and to keep attention with the speaker. And so this not only supports your ability to focus, but also helps you ensure that the speaker can see that you're focused and engaged. So like Manuel said, the person sort of shut everything down to pay attention to what he was saying in those moments. And so instead of thinking about and sort of mentally rehearsing what you might say when the speaker is done, an active listener carefully considers the speaker's words and then commits them to memory. You're committing them to memory, who's saying it and what they're saying. And so now I want us to talk about these sort of 3 levels of listening. And these 3 levels of listening, they come from a book called Coactive Coaching. And so Casey, you can drop that link in the chat. And so the first is, so in this book, they detail 3 levels of listening. So internal listening, so at level 1, so level 1, 2, and 3. So at level 1, our awareness is on ourselves. We listen to the person's words, but our attention is on what it means to us personally. And so there's only one question. What does this mean to me? Including my thoughts, my judgments, my feelings, and my conclusions. The next is focused listening. That's asking this question, what does it mean to them? So at this point, there's a really sharp focus on the other person, listening for their words, their expressions, their emotions. You're paying attention to context clues, not only what they say, but how they say it and what they don't say. And so you also tune in to what you perceive as their values and how they look at the world. This level is empathic, it's clarifying, and collaborative. And so again, the question to keep in mind is, what does this mean to them? I'll capture the last one, global listening, and then we'll take a break. But global listening is to understand better. We're asking and thinking about, what are all the discernible elements telling me? And so at this level, you listen as if the other person is at the center of the universe. Like, I liked how Manuel described sort of like, you just felt like everything else shut down and you're like in this sort of channel with this person. So you're receiving information from everywhere at once, often described as environmental listening. For me as a facilitator, I think this was the greatest challenge moving to Zoom, is that I really lose so much of my opportunity to listen globally. You don't get all the body language, you don't get all the side talk, you don't get all those kinds of elements. And so in the book, the authors describe global listening as like a force field that contains you, such as that everything that you can observe, see, hear, smell, feel, it becomes a type of hidden radio wave that you can tune into and receive. And so at this level, you're sensitive to really subtle stimuli from the other person, including how they respond to what you say and the environment itself. And so this is like reading a room, monitoring how it changes in response to you and adjusting appropriately. In global listening, it includes tapping into your intuition. But it's essential to also recognize that our intuition can also be biased. And so the guiding question for this level is to understand better, what are the discernible elements telling me? And so the prompts are, what does this mean to me? That's internal. Level 2 is focus. What does this mean to them? And then level 3 is to understand better, what are all of the elements telling me? This really, to me, is learning to like practice as an empath. So to be an empath means that you're sort of feeling all the things that are around you. So let's take, at this point, we'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back. We'll finish talking about listening, and then that will set us up for our conversation on the scenarios. Okay? Sound good?
Sounds
All right, see you
good.
back in 10. So before I move into the last sort of elements of listening and then feedback, any thoughts or reflections from what we've shared so far?
One just minor like phrasing, Megan, that was really helpful for me when you mentioned practice empathy and like emphasize an idea of practice. I think it was just that was a helpful message for me to internalize and take again, that like, oh, these are things that to try to keep doing, even if it seems like, oh, I'm not naturally this way, or whatever people may say towards that, the idea of this is something to improve on, a skill to build up. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anything else? Thanks, Tyler. All right, so now I want to talk about 3 sort of additional elements from the literature that are really kind of functions of power, as we keep talking about here. So we're going to talk about listening and class, listening and culture, and then listening and gender, and what some of the literature tells us about. So these are things to be aware of when we're listening, right? So again, this is what the literature tells us. It's not a be all end all. It's not a sort of everyone based on these sort of identifications, but there are things to keep in mind. So let's talk about the one on the right first, class. So research tells us that people with higher social status, so based, one's position in a social hierarchy, they're more likely to interrupt others. So keep this in mind and be prepared if you are speaking to a high status person, or try to resist it if you are the high status person in an interaction. The next is around culture. So some cultures place more importance on listening than other cultures. So in general, collectivist cultures, they tend to value listening more than individualistic cultures that are more speaker oriented. And so the value placed on verbal and nonverbal meaning also varies by culture and influences how we listen. So a low context communication style is one in which much of the meaning generated within an interaction comes from the verbal communication used rather than the nonverbal or the contextual cues. So for examples, US Americans of like European descent generally use low context communication styles, while people in East Asian and Latin American cultures use high context communication styles. And so low context, remember, is that style in which much of the meaning is coming from the verbs, the verbal communication used, rather than the nonverbal or context cues. And the next thing to remember is that around listening and gender. So much of the research on gender differences and communication has been influenced by gender stereotypes and falsely connected to biological differences. So the whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus, like it's BS work, right? Like it's not actual literature, but it has informed an entire generation of people's beliefs on like how listening and communication happen. So more recent research, actual research, has found that people communicate in ways that do conform to gender stereotypes in some situations and not in others. And this shows that our communication is more influenced by societal expectations rather than innate or gendered hardwiring. So for example, through socialization, men are generally discouraged from expressing emotions in public, whereas a woman sharing an emotional experience with a man may perceive the man's lack of emotional reaction as a sign of inattentiveness, especially if he typically shows more emotion during private interactions. The man, however, may be listening, but withholding nonverbal expressiveness because of social norms. So he may not even realize that withholding those expressions could be seen as a lack of empathetic or active listening. Researchers have also dispelled this belief that men interrupt more than women do, finding that men and women interrupt each other with similar frequency in cross-gender encounters. So men may interrupt each other more in same gender interactions as a conscious or subconscious attempt to establish dominance, because such behaviors are expected, because men are generally again, big generally here, generally socialized to be more competitive than women. However, this type of competitive interrupting isn't as present in cross-gender interactions because the contexts have shifted. So again, this is what some of the literature tells us, and there are things to keep in mind. From a personal example, I remember I was in a work environment many years ago, and we were having some sort of gender challenges between myself and a male colleague. And meaning like he was being elevated more based on the sort of patriarchy of the thing. And a colleague of mine said, Megan, do you realize that you keep interrupting this person? And I was like, no, I don't, but thank you for telling me. Like, let me pay attention to this. And then in my own self-reflection on this, I realized like it was my attempt to assert some dominance in a space to sort of reclaim power that I was losing. And so we have, all of us, again, are guilty of perpetuating these kinds of behaviors, and we need to pay attention to them. It is helpful when you have trusted colleagues who can help draw attention to that. And I made an agreement with her. She was sitting next to me, and I was like, she just started like grabbing my arm every time I did it. Cause like I didn't even realize I was doing it. It was so unconscious. And so that was a really big favor that she offered to me. So another framework that we can look at here, and Casey, you can drop the link here in the chat. And this strategy is from Donna Wilson and Marcus Conyers. And so they use this framework called HERE. And so it helps us sort of recognize and block out noise and devote that attention to listening to one another. And so it has 4 steps and a handy acrostic, and where she overlays these different levels. So halt is stop what you're doing, clear your inner dialogue, whatever's going on in here, so that you give that listener, give the speaker your attention. This is where you like choosing to listen at that level too. That's that level of which you're asking, what does something mean to them? Engage, this is where you're focusing on the speaker. You're signaling to them that you're focused on what they are saying. Again, this is level 2 listening. Anticipate, this is where level 3 listening really comes into help, that global listening. So you're listening with anticipation and expectation that you will likely learn something new and interesting. Listen as if you might learn something. And then finally, R is replay. You're to ensure an understanding, you replay a paraphrase analysis of the information you heard. What I hear you saying is, followed by, is that right? Or something similar. And you can download this is an acrostic later on, but Casey put that link in the chat. And so one thing for us to keep in mind as we're moving from listening to feedback here is that, you know, how we respond to what we're hearing is the feedback that we're going to be talking about in this 3rd skill. So we've talked about asset mindset, we've talked about listening, and now we're talking about feedback. And so the question here is, when we think about what you say and how you say it matters. And so my question is, how will you practice coaching rather than telling? This is from an instructional standpoint. This is what we call guided inquiry. Learning to ask questions rather than to give an answer. And this is also a skill that you can practice. And so you can practice it in a variety of different ways. And so if you want to take on this sort of coaching mindset, how you do that is to stop yourself, and instead of always giving an answer, turn back to them with the question, so that they are actually creating their knowledge based on their own cognitive sort of realities, right? So if I just tell you an answer, so if Tyler says, how do I be more empathetic? And I'm like, here's a 4-part framework. If I would instead turn it back to him and ask, well, how do you think you can practice empathy based on what you've learned? If he then constructs it from his own knowledge, rather than me than just telling him, what's he going to remember most? the construction from his own knowledge. And so this is something you can practice. So the characteristics of effective feedback are, again, this is sort of broken out in the handout that you have, but we always want that feedback to be specific and informative. We want it to be timely, frequent, based on initial steps. That's meaning that you're giving feedback that's connecting to the initial things that they've done, that it is respectful and informative. So like respectful seems like it's a given, but it is not always in practice, right? We want to have feedback that has a growth mindset. So that means that we're focused on the effort that someone puts into it rather than the sort of expectation that it is always just a function of some intelligence that they bring. The prompting and not answering, that we're praising the process, not ability, which is also connected to growth mindset. And the last is implying confidence of goal completion. So the confidence of goal completion is, this particular research is from Carl Jaeger and his work around, it's called wise feedback. And so all of this is from the literature, and it's built into the handout that you're going to use for this next activity. But before we do that, I want us to think about, what are some of the filters that influence our feedback? What are some of the filters that influence our feedback? So the way that we see and understand the world influences how we interact with it, how we interact with others, how we make decisions, and how we interpret others' actions. So to be equitable and inclusive leaders, educators, humans, whomever, we must understand how our identities bias our perceptions. And we know that we're all complex individuals with complex identities. We may identify ourselves based on our familial roles, our professions, our hobbies, our aspirations. The social and political context inform parts of who we are. Some identities are externally visible, some aren't, some aren't as salient at times, and others are kept to ourselves. And so the question is, like, what is your lens? What is your positionality? That's the social political context that creates your identity. So I want you to think about this for a second. What are some of the filters that influence your feedback? You can either think about this from the perspective of how you serve on tenure committees, or it can be feedback to anyone, wherever you are in your career and how you're giving feedback. What are those filters that influence your feedback?
I was attempting to figure out how to best type this in, but it's often so dependent on who I'm talking to. And that speaks to the salience, right? But it depends. Like, often if I'm in a group, speaking to your point, where if my age may place me as one of the younger people in the group, that comes to the forefront. Or if it's something where my race or my gender, I tend to feel that more. At work, my position as an administrator, like, that naturally comes to the forefront because that's how I operate and interact with and most people. But then I also have those moments where, you know, it's not one of the identities on the wheel, but then I'm like, oh, I get to connect with someone as a human around in this particular way on this topic. So it's always shifting, but it's always there.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. There's some more contributions here. Your relationship, your self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that you can accomplish a task. The context of the feedback, your expertise. Power dynamics are generally always at play. Another sort of nod to the relationship. Self-esteem is how you feel about yourself. It's sort of your self-worth, which is different than self-efficacy, which it's just tied to your ability around a specific task. So these are all filters that can influence our feedback, and how they're at play. I'm pretty sure I've shared with you all the positionality tool. I feel like I had okay. So I've got a slide here with a link that I'll share with you to understand your positionality. And so using this to connect with this model that we're going to learn today. And so to plan our feedback, we've got a tool that helps us sort of break down into 4 buckets. 1 is to establish our purpose. 2nd is to analyze our filter. 3 is to craft the feedback, and 4 is to prepare our approach. And so to analyze our filter, we have to reflect on our positionality. And what positionality is this social and political context that creates our identity, and how our identity influences, biases our perception of an outlook on the world. And so I've got a resource available on my website, but it looks like the link isn't in the my notes here. Casey, can you jump on my website and search positionality and then get that link and share it with everyone?
Yep.
As a side note, I am planning to, well, actually two things. I'm teaching a course with the University of Texas starting May 15th. This is random note before I tell you about this other one, called Inclusive Engineering Fundamentals. It's open to anyone, and you can earn a micro credential from the University of Texas. If you're interested in that, I can share that link with you. But after I teach that class, I'm going to be teaching through Engineer Inclusion, like a 4-week course on positionality to help you work through that and to identify what is your positionality and how does that change in different environments. So if you're interested in learning more, you can, but I've got a 26-page resource already on my website that I'm turning into a full workbook that'll be available during that course. And so, yes, you got it. Thanks so much, Casey. So that link that Casey put in the chat is where you can download the resource to learn more about this. The next way to evaluate our filter, and we're going to focus on this section rather than the others because this is what's mostly tied to inclusion. But the second is to value multiple ways of knowing and doing. This is that asset mindset. So if we have an asset mindset, we're looking at multiple ways of knowing and doing and finding the values and strengths within them. And so when we employ that asset or strengths-based perspective, it's allowing us to look at what people are doing and how they're contributing in a way that it's bringing value to a space. The next thing that we have to do is to intentionally minimize power dynamics. If power is a big part of your identity, you might have a little bit more work in this space to recognize how power shows up. But to minimize power dynamics means things like, for me, I'll share how I do this, is one, I don't make people call me Dr. Pollock. So I am Megan, so that reduces that power dynamic. I also have a very casual approach with people. So I try to be casual so that people who feel like they're stepping into a conversation with me and that they have to be really formal, I reduce that, because if we're having to be super formal, that again is just reinforcing a power dynamic. I also try to use language that helps people know that I see them, that I actually see them as my equal, so that I'm never stepping into a space where that I feel like they're gifted with my time, that they're gifted with my knowledge and expertise. So I try to say, I'm excited to see what I learned from you today, right? So you're seeing them as an equal in those spaces. So those are some things I do. In your role, you're going to have to figure out what are some of the ways that you function. And then finally, assess the climate for inclusivity, which are so many of the things that we've already talked about. All right, so now we are going to get ready to apply this. And so we're going to do an exercise, and you're going to open up the Padlet. So the links, Casey, I think let's drop them, the original links back in there. I think the link in the notes there is not correct. And so let's see, here's the long link, it's not the short link. So we're going to have everybody open up this Padlet. And so what you'll find is the green box here are the scenarios, and I've modified them to best as I can more closely relate with the tenure review process at your institution. So don't go to that Padlet. That's actually the one from last year. So the link in the chat that she just put, don't do that one. Go to the one I put in there. So again, let me drop that in the chat there. So go to this link. We're going to break up into groups, and I want you to reflect on asset mindset, empathic listening, and feedback. And so in your groups, because we've got small groups and more time today, we're not going to just do one scenario. I want you to work through them as best that you can, work through all four. And so as you reflect on asset mindset, for example, for this first scenario, then you will reply to this with your specific comments and ideas around asset mindset. And so you'll do that for each of the scenarios. The PDF handout on planning your feedback is right here. So if you wanted to open it in your browser, it'll be right there. And then we'll again pull you back. So I want to give you, we'll probably start with 20 minutes and then check in with you all. So again, the prompts are, in what ways could an asset mindset change the course of the conversation? Asking things like what else might be true, what is of value, in what ways could empathic listening change the faculty members' feeling of belongingness? And then what would effective feedback and look like and sound like? And so if you are so inclined, you can role play this, but that also causes many people great anxiety, the notion of role playing. So I will leave that to your groups and how you want to enact that. So Casey, let's set up groups of groups of 3.
Perfect.
And give time for everybody to go through this. So whatever your group number is, start with that scenario and then capture the others so that we don't have everybody working on one at the same time. Does that work? So we'll set up for 20 minutes. I'll check in on you. And we'll see you back in 20. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back.
Hi, everyone. Okay. So we've got just a handful of minutes before we go into our last break, and then we'll come back and do an application of all the tools that we've learned. But I want to allow us a chance to do a little bit of a debrief here. And so the first scenario, would you all like to kind of give a recap of your takeaways from this scenario?
This is us, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So I was just typing up some notes. I can start sharing for our group, unless Tina, I don't recall if you're the spokesperson.
I am, but I also see that I don't know if I see all there are notes there. Right here, I say, feel free to start, and then I'm glad to.
Okay. So with this scenario, there's a lot of, like there's no questions that are asked. Like the faculty member shares about kind of challenges that are coming up, and there isn't a single question. It's just some very quick sort of feedback that has a very deficit mindset of, oh, you're not probably trying hard enough. You're not doing well enough at this. And so we talked a lot about being empathetic and asset minded in the way of beginning with kind of questions asked to ask the faculty member, like, what is it that caused you to want to publish in the first place? To kind of determine if there was sort of a personal interest, professional interest, sort of so be it, to go in that direction, to kind of focus on what the person is bringing to the table from the asset mindset. We also talked a bit about, in terms of empathetic listening, wanting to ask, what are the challenges? What are the things potentially giving this person anxiety or challenge with the publication process, to try and understand that experience better. Our scenario was a lot of like, don't do what the person's doing here, of like, oh, you're just not trying hard enough. So we're kind of doing the opposite of that, of asking the questions, getting to the person's interests, and trying to go from there as far as feedback.
I liked one of the things that you all said in the group of like trying to get to the bottom of why do they want to publish, because I think that particularly within an academic space, it helps to that is a coaching technique. So tell me the reasons why you want to publish in the first place, not in a deprecating your dreams suck kind of way, but to help them detether potentially ways in which we are locked into a system that isn't always designed for us. And so it may be that they find that publishing a paper isn't actually the goal. Maybe what their goal is to get their ideas out and heard. And then that gives you an opportunity to pivot and say, hey, well, have you considered these other avenues to help you deliver that, right? So that doesn't come out unless you've actually questioned them, because certainly the notion to publish is something that's really common within academia. But it doesn't always, publishing doesn't always mean people read it. And so if your goal is to have content people read, there are other ways. Thanks. All right, so group 2, scenario 2, some takeaways from your conversation.
That was Ava, Heather, and Manuel.
So our scenario was about a faculty member who felt that there was bias in their student evaluations. And then the solution that his chair came up with was to observe him and then give him feedback that was not appropriate. So we kind of, and obviously Ava and Manny, feel free to chime in if you want to add anything or disagree with anything I've said, but just that there was no listening to the faculty member. So they weren't really, like, the supervisor was not focused on the problem, but it wasn't reflective. It was just like, okay, like, I'm going to come in and like give you real feedback or whatever. And then with the listening, there was no focus on the professor's experience. And additionally, the professor brought literature supporting, the fact that people in his situation are often evaluated differently by students. And then effective feedback would have just been listening with more empathy, asking the instructor what support was needed, and then seeing if the data could be disaggregated or looked at and through a different lens that might provide more context for the feedback.
Yeah, good. I'll just add that Ava was able to share a personal experience that related very specifically with this case. And obviously her experience wasn't very favorable after I don't know if it was a chair or a dean told her that she might want to change her accent, or I'm not sure exactly the comment, Ava, that they made, but it was some to that end that she should practice eliminating her accent.
Yeah,
Which is this.
I was told that I should work on my accent, but it was very long time ago.
And what did I tell you, Ava?
I remember, Chris. Yeah, so I stopped caring about that, but my current dean she's really very, very supportive about that, and she was like, just ignore that part, and you speak perfectly fine, and ask how many people can speak as many languages as you speak. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I popped in your group, and well, all of your groups, but heard you share that, and even just the choice of our vocabulary that we use. I had feedback on a conference paper that I finalized last week, and I believe that one of the reviewers, I believe that English may not have been their first language, and they offered feedback, critical feedback, that I used a bunch of colloquialisms that weren't understood. And some of my colleagues were like, oh, that's so dumb. And I was like, why is it dumb? Somebody told me I use phrases they don't understand. So that gives me an opportunity to be more clear, right? This is also something that we often do with sports analogies. How many of you are in environments where just like there are copious amounts of sports analogies, and people who don't play sports just like are like, I don't know what they're saying, right? When I remember when I gave my dissertation at the end, when my faculty went to comment, Dr. Polly was like, I want you to know that you had 7 sports references in 35 minutes. And I didn't know, right? And so how does that create inclusion? So again, language is something all of us have a responsibility in figuring out ways to improve how we communicate. I know we're pushing on time here, but I want to acknowledge with scenario 1 and 2 that there is a unique opportunity for the committee member to practice true empathy and connection with the person who's experiencing this, and just sitting with them for a minute and saying, well, I'm really sorry you're struggling to publish. Like, that sucks. Publishing is hard. And just letting them have some space to listen. With the scenario number 2, when they're getting bad reviews, opportunity for the committee member to be like, dang it, you're right. These evaluations they have lots of bias that exists. And I'm really sorry that you're being, you're receiving these evaluations, because I've observed your class and I, think these things, right? And so there's such an opportunity to have that just human connection with somebody rather than just jumping to solutions. You want to just sit with people and let them feel seen. Let them feel seen. Okay, scenario 3, and then we'll jump to break.
We're playing chicken apparently. And I always lose because I always have to comment on that. So this one, the third scenario is really interesting because this professor seems to be doing a great job in the description. They've got full classes, wait lists, students are really engaged. It's a student-centered learning environment. It sounds like a lot of the things that we're really wanting of our professors. And yet the feedback that this professor gets is that their teaching style is loose and fancy free, and they need to do some more focus on the content of the course. And so that was the first thing that we were noting in our conversation, was just that this person clearly has some incredible assets in the classroom that are completely ignored in terms of the feedback that they're receiving. And it seems like their teaching style is being conflated with a different sort of component of teaching, which is the content itself. And just because this person didn't really connect with the way this person teaches, they are jumping to this kind of conclusion that it is impacting the content as well, and they need to work on that curricular content more effectively. I don't know, Tyler, anyone else want to jump in here? But so we talked a lot about how each of us, when we do observations and have those conversations, we typically want to first let that person share their own experience in the classroom. Like, what do you think is going really well in the class? What did you think didn't go as well? Like, actually letting that person share their experience and having that be, what's facilitating or driving a lot of the conversation first before you're getting into those things, and making sure that we're praising them for the things that they are doing really, really well. And even utilizing the things they're doing really well as a way of maybe broaching these other aspects of their teaching, because you can point out, hey, you're doing this really, really well, and this is why this is working. Can we apply that maybe in another way to this other component of teaching? So utilizing their skills that they already have to help them make those connections. Tyler or Christy, do you want to share other stuff here with empathetic listening or empathic listening or feedback?
Yeah, Justin, I think you nailed it pretty much. I just think the way that they characterized their teaching style was not very empathetic, and clearly, I would think that most people would agree that when you start a conversation and you focus on a negative, you start in a deficit. And by asking those kind of setup questions and focusing on strengths, you foster an asset mindset, I think, for the faculty to focus on what they're doing well. And then you can address, areas of need for improvement. But, I think too, with this scenario, it sounds like students are doing really well with this instructor. And so there's clearly content, being relayed at some point. And maybe it was just a particular day that context wasn't clear. Justin had mentioned, doing an observation like the day before spring break. So I just thought, maybe that could be another example of, the context isn't always, clear. They might be getting to content later.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about how you're observing 1 hour, 1 hour and a half of a class, not a full semester. So what you're seeing in that particular slice of that class is not necessarily indicative of everything that ever happens in that class. And so if you do have questions about content or whatever, that's a talking point in the conversation where hopefully that professor is given that opportunity to share some of those things they're doing. That can't necessarily be put on the form or whatever, but it still should be something that you're talking about in a way where they're able to bring to the conversation how they do those things that you're questioning, because you weren't seeing them in the way that you expected.
Christy, did you want to add something?
Only that we talked about having the 1 hour. Like for some classes are 4 or 5 hours long, and getting to see what happens in 1 hour, and it, that 1 hour could be the first thing in the morning, and there could just be a perfect storm of any type of thing that could possibly go wrong, and sometimes it does. And it's always a challenge to have that be recorded. So as the instructor, you're seeing, these things are going wrong, and then that really kind of impacts how you proceed through, because you start to internalize things and stuff can get away. It's very easy. So as an observer, you just need to be empathetic and understand, and think that would help.
Thanks, Christy. Yeah, so what I see showing up here is a pretty intense power dynamic of like a teacher, an evaluator showing up and saying, well, that's not how I do it. When I teach content, I've got a bunch of slides with a bunch of words that have all the content that's deeply explicit. And so instead of asking what else might be true, maybe I don't know culturally responsive teaching, maybe I don't know how to use a student focused lens, that I'm actually evaluating you against my way of teaching. And so of course it's wrong, right? And so that's what they could have done, is sat down and said like, wow, you used a bunch of strategies I've never seen before. Can you help me understand how you use these teaching strategies to teach your students? Because clearly they're learning, right? And so that reduced power dynamic that shifts from I'm the one that has the power to control how things are evaluated to like, we are equals, and what can I learn from you, is a really big shift. And that takes some ego reduction in that process. All right, so I want to give us, can I trim your break to like 5 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll do application? Is that okay with everybody? Typically I like to promise it. I'm also okay if we just want to power through, but maybe a little stretch break is good for us. Okay, 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and do application and then wrap up the day.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. All right, Megan, we are back.
Right, thank you so much. Okay, so to recap, what we've talked about today are 3 different kinds of skills and practices that allow us to better employ, that we can better employ to create more connection, inclusion within the tenure process. So we talked about asset mindset, empathic listening, and intentional feedback. And so what I want us to do for our last bit of time is to review all of the different tools and strategies that you have gathered from this series. We talked about the cognitive biases and the unbiasing method in the first session, as well as the session pledge. You were introduced to that. The second workshop, you have the stewarding prompts, and then the planning your feedback tool is today's. And so now we're going to go into some action planning, and I want you to reflect on how are you going to use these tools. I want you to really think about which of these is most relevant to you. So Justin already talked about how he's using the session pledge. Christina has already shared with us in the weeks prior how she has been using that as well. I want you to think about how do you take these tools to change the ways, the system in which you operate, and plug them into your life and work. Because if we don't think about how are we going to plug them in, they're going to get lost, and you're going to lose the potential from using these tools. So Casey, if you can put everybody in groups, let's do groups of 4 now.
Okay.
Actually, I want us to do this in pairs because I want this to
Okay.
be like, I think pairs share a deep reflection of that. So shuffle everybody up. Let's do 6 minutes.
Okay.
So 6 minutes reflection of like how you're going to apply these. But before I put you in groups, I actually want you to reflect on this yourself. So get the groups ready, but for now, it's independent reflection of how you're going to use these 5 tools. And then if you have other tools that you want to share, you can upload those over here on the right. So I'll set a little timer on the screen for independent reflection before we open up the groups for the pair and the share. All right, about 20 more seconds, and then we're gonna put you into groups and pairs. And so again, you're reflecting on what's your plan of action, how will you use these tools, and how will you foster belonging and success for people in the tenure process. All right, so Casey, let's do, since we just did reflection, let's do 5 minutes and the breakouts and pairs.
Perfect. All right, all set to open?
Yep.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Tina, just to finish that thought, it's like you have an agenda at your meetings, but there are plenty of tenure committees that don't even meet. So there's no point, there's no agenda to look at.
All right, welcome back. So what I'd like for us to do for the last 10 minutes before the sort of official end and then open discussion is I'd like for everyone to go around the room and to share what it is that your specific action that you want to employ. And then you'll have about a handful of people who can ask you in a couple of weeks how that's going. And so what I want you to do is we'll have the first person go, and then when you're done, you'll call on the next person. So you get to pick whoever follows. So Christina, since you were the one that brought us all together initially, would you be willing to go first?
Yes, could you restate the prompt one more time? Because I know it has to do with the next steps, but.
Yeah, so what's your action? Like pick which of these tools are you going to apply, and we're sharing this out loud for the sake of accountability. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other people here who can be like, hey, Christina, how's it going doing this thing that you said you were going to do?
Yeah, I think so the cognitive biases is something that we already integrate into the tenure committees so far, and then revisiting the unbiasing method at times. My goal is, and this is where it becomes like a collective process over the next few months, or when the next time, there's so much time in between when the committees will reconvene, but a number of them will be reconvening in the fall within the first few weeks. So what I'd like to do is to get some feedback now that we've had a few meetings together, especially with some of the newer ones, to say like, well, what else might we be missing? And to Chris's point, we use agendas, and it's meant to be consistent it's to help kind of say that we close out each of our meetings with, well, how do we support this tenure candidate further? And that's usually where it's like you get to, is it other follow-up check-ins? Is there something else that we're not thinking of? And that may be an opportunity to kind of revisit more materials or just another entry point. So I don't quite know, but
I like that. That's absolutely a stewarding question
yeah.
that you're leaving open in the end.
Yeah.
Thanks. All right, you call on the next person.
Heather.
Thanks. So I think, in my role, I don't engage in the tenure committees in the same way, but I think kind of to piggyback on what Tina's saying, just to support those that are engaging more directly by, making sure that the support and the tools are available to be implemented and that I'm available to help people implement them. And on top of that, just working a lot of the vocabulary that we've learned, not only through committees and things like that, but just through all of what we put out from the department, and just making sure that that is kind of, worked into the vernacular here and into the culture.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. So as you're figuring out who you're going to call on next, yeah, it doesn't have to be tenure committee. So it's however you can apply this in your life. So you pick the next person.
I will pick Tyler O'Donnell.
Yeah, kind of similar to Heather. I haven't been on a tenure committee yet, but been doing observations. So I found them all very helpful. I put them up on my wall, the cognitive biases, the unbiasing method, and then the session pledge. And then specifically, I keep a copy of the planning feedback as I work through my first couple of classroom observations, because I think it helps me just kind of to revisit that every so often as I'm writing my feedback and making sure that I'm being as thorough as possible and conscientious of my language that I'm using. So yeah, they're just kind of continuing using that planning feedback PDF prompt as I work through my observations to end the semester. And I will call on Manny.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. So for me as a both IC, I do a lot of observations of faculty members, and also now participating in a tenure committee. One of the major commitments I'll have is to reference the stewarding prompts as I'm preparing for observations, and also really post observation conversations that I have with faculty members. And something that could be more institutional is trying to advocate and recommend that these prompts are part of the actual form that we use, so that it can be a prompt for everyone as they're going into filling out the form and going into having discussions with faculty members to kind of cue in these stewarding prompts and kind of positioning them in a place of support rather than criticism.
I like that, Manuel. And if you haven't read this book, DEI Deconstructed, this book by Lily Zhang, it also has lots of great questions for systematizing some of this work. So I recommend this as an additional resource. All right, Manuel, who's next? Thank you.
Chris.
Well, the planning feedback section from today, I'm going to be able to implement a lot of that in my teaching, because I've shifted. I try to rotate through the courses that we offer in the math department, and right now I'm doing the gen ed ones, and so it's a lot more difficult to provide meaningful feedback and support to my students in those types of classes than it is for my future engineers in Calc 3 or differential equations. So I really like the fact that I can apply these to my classroom. As far as how I would be, what am I looking to do with the tenure process? I'm looking to burn it down to the ground the way we do it here at ECC right now, and build it up based on this stuff, where the idea that we've changed the way we teach so much in the past several decades based on research, based on data and all of this stuff, but we have not changed how we put people through the tenure process. And so I'd like to take the strategies that we have found to be so beneficial and so effective in the classroom and move them into the tenure process, so that we're modeling the behavior we want to see, that we're providing the support that is necessary, that it is a transparent and supportive process to go through, and that there's consistency across the college, because I've been on tenure committees that have never met. Everything's been done through email. And I have never once been asked the question, how can we support this person in tenure, by the lead on any of the committees I've served on. So there needs to be a more consistent process across the college. And then I believe Ava has not gone yet.
Thank you, Kristen. I agree with you. I can use a lot of planning feedback in my classroom, and I taught Gen Ed med classes for many semesters, and as well as developmental med classes. So those are very helpful hints how to give those students feedback, and each class is different, each student is different. So having those students, you can learn a lot from them, and you can apply those tools that we have here today, and not even today, like previous session. I can really apply those for communication and feedback, and being empathetic for students. So basically put yourself into their shoes, and then make some comments. That's my takeout from today. And I think Tyler didn't speak, right? So should I call on Tyler?
Yeah, I can go. Thanks, Eva. So for me, I guess a really specific one is in communication, that first part about communicating high expectations and our belief that folks can succeed at those. I think for me, a takeaway sort of action plan is both in formal settings, sort of formal settings with faculty development pieces of professional learning opportunities, as well as informal, like thinking about the things that I recognize are going to be a stretch for folks and explicitly communicating that. But the second part, obviously very important to it, communicating that I believe that people can succeed at this in terms of self-efficacy. So I think being mindful of that moment and not wanting to sort of, I was talking to Manuel about this in the breakout room, like striking the balance of like baby steps and let's get there, let's take small steps, while at the same time also having strong challenges to people that are supported. So I think communicate that explicitly more so. I'll turn things over to Justin then.
I feel like the last kid picked for kickball. I'm really excited about, I've been using some of these already. The website that you have, Megan, is excellent because you've got these PDFs that are colorful, easy to use. I've been sharing those with my committee, and we bring those into the conversation, and that's been really helpful. I know in the fall it's going to have been this big gap since we met last and talked last, so I'm going to definitely start us again with the stewarding prompts and make sure we go through that, and just make sure we're all giving the process the justice it deserves, and giving that person the support they need. The other thing I really am excited for, yeah, thanks Megan, best for last, I appreciate that. The planning feedback, because you do have these things so easy to share. I know that there are people on my committee that really haven't done observations or haven't done them nearly to the extent as other people, and I'm really excited to have this really handy kind of guide just to share with them and talk with them before they do their observation, and maybe even following the observation, just to make sure that they feel really comfortable and confident with what is expected of them and how to facilitate that conversation with the person. So I'm really excited to integrate that in as well.
That's awesome. And I appreciate the feedback on my website. That means a lot. So I'm glad it's useful. So again, we don't have to leave if you still have time, but I do want to acknowledge that for those people who do have to drop off, I do value your feedback. It does help me improve. And so you can visit my website at engineeringinclusion.com/thanks and submit some feedback. And if there are other tools that you think would be useful, let me know. Something, Tyler, that you said that reminded me that I really need to create a new tool is a tool around self-efficacy that helps us understand the external systems of disadvantage and oppression that lead to someone's self-efficacy, because we often forget about that. We say we're just trying to help you build up, but what really has to happen is we have to change the system so that can often happen. And so that's a note. I'm like, okay, got to get to that one. And so that's something that I'll create. If you aren't on my mailing list, make sure that you join it so that you'll get new resources when I create them. And Christina, I think that you have a post test that you're going to send to everyone.
Yes, usually it may not come directly from me. I think we're still coordinating the dissemination of that, but usually within the next few days, you'll receive an email with a link to the post survey. So please feel free to complete that, or please complete that, please complete it, because it does help us with navigating the next or future versions of this. So thank you.
Yeah. And I'm quite delayed, but I finally finished the videos from the first and the second session. And so as soon as I get this one done, I'm going to try to do it today and not get so behind on my video production. I'll send those to Tyler, and Tyler, you can add those links to the CETL system. Chris?
Just a suggestion of a topic for you to explore, to include some things that I picked up through AQ training in my classroom is providing student agency. So I give a voice to my students in setting the syllabus and determining assessments and all of these things. And I have found it to be an incredibly impactful thing in the classroom. And so since it just seems like there should be a way to be able to do that in the tenure process as well, so that the person in tenure has some say in what's happening, how often you meet, who you talk to, and that kind of thing. So I would think that that would be an effective tool, but I would have no idea how to develop it. So I'm handing it to you, and you have your homework now.
Thank you for the homework, Chris. It's appropriate. Student agency in general is like kind of the soapbox that I'm stuck on lately. And it is a function of relinquishing power, right? So when we give people choice, so we are taking away some of our power so that they can have that. So that certainly fits in with my mission and focus. Thanks, Chris. What else? Any additional ideas, thoughts, reactions, reflections that you want to share with the group today?
All right, I
So
have
I
a
think,
question.
okay, great.
I paused long enough to make sure. Are you aware of any place that has an ombudsman type role on campuses for people in the tenure process to turn to if they think that there is something going wrong? Because the way our school is set up, their immediate supervisor is most likely the person who is in charge of their tenure committee. And so there's not really a safe place, a safe person designated for them to go to if you're being asked to work while on medical leave, or you're being asked to travel at your own cost during your off time, kind of thing. And I'm just curious what you've seen on other campuses or other areas where, how do they handle those kinds of things?
Yeah, so does your campus have an ombudsman at all, or is it just for students?
There is no ombudsman at ACC at all. There is I don't know if he's a dean or an assistant, I don't know what his title is, but there's a student success person, John Long, that students can go to if they're having problems in the classroom, but there's no equivalent for faculty to go to if there's issues within the.
I would think the next thing that you could try would go to the faculty senate to see if there's some connection there that can help you. I think that ideally human resources should have some kind of function there, because some of what you're describing is actually like against the law. And so there should be like a Title IX sort of element to civil rights,
Yeah.
Title IX to that.
Yeah, if it's illegal, yes, we have designated people for the Title VII issues, EEOC issues, and those kinds of things. I mean, you're not necessarily going to do it if you're in the tenure process, because you have to balance whether, what's the impact on tenure going to be. But I'm just like, not so much somebody who's going to fix the problem as, have you ever seen anyone in a role where they're just there to listen? And it's confidential,
Yeah, so
and they can provide
to answer
advice
your
on who
question,
to.
no, I don't
Yep.
know any great examples, because too often we know that HR systems are designed to protect the company and the organization, and they're not set up to protect people. We know that reporting anything comes at great risk to the person, even in spite of the organization's goals. So it comes down to culture and climate. So within your sphere of influence, of how are you creating cultures and climates that allow people to speak up to those challenges and say, like, no, this isn't okay. And so no, I don't have any great examples. The solution outside of true institutionalized, like, we're now going to suddenly all value this, is within your sphere of influence, adjusting the culture and climate so that it's normal for people to speak up and say, this is happening to me and it's not okay. Because it's all about power. People don't speak up to it because they feel powerless to the results, and the risk that might provide. So the more that we reduce those power structures, the more people are going to be able to speak to them. It's not an easy answer, but
I just have a question about the continuation of this training. Are there plans to continue and expand this, or where does this sit?
Tina and I can follow up a little bit on that at a later time. Where it's at right now, Manuel, with this specific training coming from funding with SSI, initial next steps will be sort of discussions with SSI among other groups about what are going to be the best next steps for it. But the one thing I'll say right now is the exact question about what are the good ways to institutionalize this? How can this be folded into processes? Is very much a conversation taking place. And so if you have input, definitely, Manuel, I think probably that conversation will come up in SSI and a few other circles too. If it doesn't, or if you're not at that meeting, please do reach out to Tina or me, anybody on this call, for advice, thoughts on where we sort of go from now, please do.
Okay.
Tina, is there anything you would add at that point, or clarify? Or
That's accurate. So much of it is not uncertain in terms of whether or not there's the value in doing this. I think the value is well established, and especially based off of the feedback and what have you. But much of it just speaks to the how, as there's a number of other systems that are impacted by how it's offered and who takes it and in what method, that type of thing. So I just wanted to clarify that point. That's it.
Thanks.
So I could see a next step that would work for you all within the systems that you have is, so Manuel, as you offered a few examples of how you could institutionalize this. So it's possible that you could create a parallel sort of guide for the tenure process of here's how I, Dr. Salgado, apply these, practices in as an overlay. And then as you put that into practice, as others put that into practice, then it creates a pathway for institutionalizing some of these things within the systems that you have to function, like the union and all those kinds of things. Lead by example, right?
Yep. All right. Thank you so much, Megan, and
Thanks so much,
everybody else.
Annie. Tyler, Heather, Justin, Eva, any additional thoughts from you all?
No, thank you.
All right.
It was fantastic. Thank you so much, Megan, and Casey as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Ava. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks.
Bye,
y'all.
everyone.